The date was October 28th, 1963, and New York City was in the process of committing what many would call architectural murder. Massive wrecking balls swung through pink granite columns that had stood for 53 years, each impact sending dust and debris cascading onto 7th Avenue below. This was not some forgotten warehouse or decrepit tenement building falling to progress. This was Pennsylvania Station, one of the most magnificent public spaces ever constructed in America, and they were tearing it down on purpose. Inside, where 200,000 people once passed daily beneath soaring glass ceilings and towering Corinthian columns, there was now only rubble and the sound of jackhammers echoing through spaces that had once been described as cathedral-like in their majesty. The Pennsylvania Railroad, the company that had built this masterpiece at a cost equivalent to over $1 billion today, was now paying to have it destroyed. They were not being forced by the city, and the building was not falling apart. In fact, the structure was so well built that demolition crews would later say it was one of the hardest buildings they had ever tried to tear down. The answer involves greed, short-sighted urban planning, and one of the most controversial real estate deals in American history. But to understand how New York let this happen, we need to go back to the beginning, when Pennsylvania Station was not just a train station, but a symbol of American ambition and architectural genius. Before we travel back to the turn of the century to see how this masterpiece was built, if you find this story as captivating as we do, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. We are dedicated to uncovering the lost history of the world around us, and your support makes these documentaries possible. Now let's go back to the beginning. At the turn of the 20th century, the Pennsylvania Railroad was the largest corporation in the world, moving more freight and passengers than any other company on Earth. But despite their dominance, they had one embarrassing problem that kept them from truly conquering the American Northeast. To get into Manhattan, the most important city in America, Pennsylvania Railroad passengers had to take a ferry. After traveling hundreds of miles in the comfort of their luxury rail cars, riders were forced to disembark in New Jersey, gather their luggage, board a ferry, cross the Hudson River, and then somehow make their way through the chaos of Manhattan streets. Their main competitor, the New York Central Railroad, could bring passengers directly into Grand Central Terminal in the heart of Manhattan. This was not just an inconvenience for Pennsylvania Railroad, it was a humiliation, and more importantly, it was costing them millions of dollars in lost business every year. Alexander Cassett, who became president of the Pennsylvania Railroad in 1899, decided this situation was unacceptable. He was going to build a tunnel under the Hudson River, bring trains directly into Manhattan, and construct a terminal so magnificent that it would put Grand Central to shame. The engineering challenges were enormous. They would have to tunnel through bedrock beneath two rivers, the Hudson and the East River, create underground platforms 70 feet below street level, and somehow manage to bring electric trains through spaces that had never been designed for them. No one had ever attempted anything like this before, and many engineers said it could not be done. But Cassett had something more than just determination. He had virtually unlimited money, the best engineers in the world, and a vision that bordered on obsession. The Pennsylvania Railroad would spend over $114 million on this project, an amount so staggering that it is almost impossible to comprehend in modern terms. Adjusted for inflation, this would be close to $4 billion today. And remember, this was for a single train station. For the design of the station itself, Cassett turned to McKim, Mead, and White, the most prestigious architectural firm in America. Charles McKim, the lead architect, had recently returned from studying the great buildings of ancient Rome, and he proposed something audacious. Pennsylvania Station would not just be a place to catch a train. It would be a temple to transportation, a monument to human achievement, and a gateway to the greatest city in the world. The main waiting room that McKim designed was inspired by the ancient Roman baths of Caracalla, with a ceiling that soared 150 feet above the floor. Steel trusses held up a ceiling of glass panels that flooded the space with natural light, creating an effect that visitors consistently described as breathtaking. The floors were travertine marble, the columns were solid granite, each one weighing hundreds of tons and carved with intricate Corinthian capitals that craftsmen had spent months perfecting. 8 granite eagles, each weighing thousands of pounds, stood guard over the space. The ticket counters were made of mahogany and brass, polished to a mirror shine. Even the underground platforms, which passengers reached by descending grand staircases or taking elevators with ornate metalwork, were designed with the same attention to detail and quality of materials. When Pennsylvania Station opened on November 27, 1910, over 100,000 people came just to see it. Newspapers called it the eighth wonder of the world. The New York Times wrote that it was so grand, so overwhelming in its beauty and scale, that it made travelers feel small in the best possible way, as if they were entering a sacred space rather than a commercial building. For the next 20 years, Pennsylvania Station functioned exactly as Cassatt had envisioned, though tragically, he died in 1906 and never saw his dream completed. The station became one of the busiest and most important transportation hubs in the world, with 200,000 people passing through it every single day. Soldiers left for both world wars from its platforms, families reunited in its waiting rooms, and for millions of immigrants arriving in New York, Pennsylvania Station was often their first impression of American grandeur. But the very success of the station and the massive amount of valuable Manhattan real estate it occupied would eventually lead to its destruction. Before we continue with how this architectural masterpiece was destroyed, if you are finding this story as fascinating and infuriating as we are, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to our channel. We cover the lost buildings, forgotten places, and hidden history of America, and your support helps us keep telling these important stories. Now, let's talk about how everything started to fall apart. The first cracks in Pennsylvania Station's future appeared not in its magnificent structure, but in the financial health of the company that owned it. The Great Depression that began in 1929 devastated American railroads, and the Pennsylvania Railroad was no exception. Passenger numbers dropped dramatically as people could no longer afford to travel. Freight shipping collapsed along with the economy. The Pennsylvania Railroad, which had seemed invincible just 20 years earlier, suddenly found itself struggling to meet its expenses. The maintenance budget for Pennsylvania Station, which required constant care given its size and the complexity of its mechanical systems, became harder and harder to justify. Then came World War II, which briefly revived the railroad's fortunes as millions of soldiers and tons of military equipment moved by train. Pennsylvania Station once again filled with crowds, and for a moment it seemed like the golden age might return. But this was only a temporary reprieve. After the war, Americans fell in love with the automobile. President Eisenhower's interstate highway system, which began construction in 1956, made long-distance car travel practical and affordable. Airlines began offering passenger service that could cross the country in hours instead of days. The railroads, which had dominated American transportation for nearly a century, suddenly found themselves competing with technologies they could not match for speed and convenience. By the mid-1950s, Pennsylvania Railroad's passenger service was losing money every year, and those losses were getting worse. The company's executives faced a brutal reality. They owned an enormous, expensive building sitting on some of the most valuable real estate in Manhattan, and that building was devoted entirely to a business that was rapidly dying. The station itself began to show signs of neglect. Brass fixtures that had once gleamed now tarnished. Marble floors cracked and were repaired with cheaper materials. The glass ceiling panels, which required regular cleaning and maintenance to maintain their brilliance, grew increasingly dingy. Pennsylvania Station was still functional and still impressive, but it was no longer maintained with the same pride and attention it had received in its first decades. James Symes, who became president of the Pennsylvania Railroad in 1954, looked at Pennsylvania Station and saw not a priceless architectural treasure, but a massive financial liability. The land beneath the station, covering 2 full city blocks in Midtown Manhattan, was worth an absolute fortune. If they could somehow build something else on that land, something that would generate revenue instead of consuming it, the railroad could solve many of its financial problems. Around this same time, Madison Square Garden, the famous arena that hosted sporting events and concerts, was facing its own crisis. The Garden occupied a building on 8th Avenue that its owners wanted to redevelop. They needed a new location, preferably one that was central, easily accessible, and large enough to accommodate a modern sports and entertainment complex. In 1961, James Symes and Irving Felt, the president of Madison Square Garden, began discussing a deal that would solve both of their problems. The Pennsylvania Railroad would sell the air rights above Pennsylvania Station to Madison Square Garden Corporation. The railroad would demolish most of the historic building, keeping only the underground platforms and tracks. Madison Square Garden would build a new arena directly on top of the remaining structure, and the Pennsylvania Railroad would pocket millions of dollars from the sale. On the surface, this seemed like smart business. The railroad would continue to operate trains from the same location, they would gain a massive influx of cash that they desperately needed, and New York would get a modern sports arena to replace the aging Madison Square Garden. There was just one problem with this plan. To build the new Madison Square Garden, they would have to destroy. One of the most beautiful buildings in America, and unlike many demolitions that happened quietly and without much public notice, this one would happen in the center of Manhattan where everyone could see it. When news of the proposed demolition became public in 1962, the reaction was immediate and fierce. The announcement that Pennsylvania Station would be demolished hit New York's architectural community like a bomb. For preservationists and architects who understood the building's significance, this was not just the loss of a train station. This was cultural vandalism on a scale that had never been seen in America. The opposition was led by some of the most respected voices in American architecture. Ada Louise Huxtable, the architecture critic for the New York Times, wrote scathing columns describing the demolition as an act of monumental civic irresponsibility. She pointed out that Penn Station was not just old, it was irreplaceable, the kind of building that would cost billions to recreate even if anyone had the skill to do so. Philip Johnson, one of America's most famous architects, organized protests and tried to rally public support for preservation. Jane Jacobs, the influential urbanist who was then fighting other destructive urban renewal projects in New York, added her voice to the opposition. They argued that the economic logic behind the demolition was flawed, that preserving the building would have more long-term value than the short-term profits from its destruction. The preservationists faced an almost impossible task. Unlike today, there was no federal law protecting historic buildings. The National Historic Preservation Act would not be passed until 1966, 3 years too late to save Penn Station. New York City had no landmarks preservation law, which meant that building owners had virtually unlimited freedom to do whatever they wanted with their property. The Pennsylvania Railroad's position was straightforward and legally unassailable. They owned the building, they needed the money, and no law prevented them from selling their air rights and demolishing whatever they chose. In meeting after meeting, railroad executives made it clear that they would not change their plans. From their perspective, the preservationists were being unrealistic and sentimental. The Pennsylvania Railroad was struggling under over $300 million in debt. Passenger rail service was dying no matter what anyone did. They had a chance to monetize their most valuable asset, and they were not going to pass that up because some architects thought the building was pretty. The protesters tried everything they could think of. They held rallies, they wrote letters to newspapers, they lobbied politicians. They tried to drum up public opposition that might force the railroad to reconsider. But they ran into a fundamental problem that would haunt preservation efforts for years to come. Most New Yorkers simply did not care enough to stop it. 2. The average commuter rushing through Pennsylvania Station twice a day, the building was just infrastructure, part of the city's background that they barely noticed. When preservationists talked about Corinthian columns and the baths of Caracalla, most people had no idea what they were talking about. When they warned that future generations would judge New York harshly for this destruction, people shrugged and went back to worrying about their jobs and their rent. The New York City government, which might have stepped in to stop the demolition, was sympathetic to the Pennsylvania Railroad's position. Mayor Robert Wagner and his administration believed in urban renewal and modernization. They thought the old Penn Station was a relic of the past, and that the new Madison Square Garden would be a symbol of progress and economic vitality. There was also the uncomfortable reality that the city stood to benefit from the deal. A new Madison Square Garden would increase property tax revenues, create construction jobs, and bring major events to Manhattan that might otherwise go to other cities. From a purely economic standpoint, at least in the short-term calculations that dominated 1960s thinking, demolition made financial sense. The preservationists' final hope was the courts. In 1962, a group called the Action Group for Better Architecture in New York filed a lawsuit seeking to block the demolition. They argued that Pennsylvania Station should be protected as a matter of public interest, that its destruction would irreparably harm New York's cultural heritage, and that the city had an obligation to preserve buildings of exceptional historical and architectural significance. The case made its way through the legal system quickly, and on January 23, 1963, the New York Court of Appeals delivered its verdict. The preservationists lost. The court ruled that while Pennsylvania Station was certainly beautiful and historically significant, property rights were paramount. The Pennsylvania Railroad owned the building, and unless there was a specific law preventing them from demolishing it, which there was not, they had every right to tear it down. With the legal battle lost, with public opinion largely indifferent, and with no political will to intervene, there was nothing left to stop the demolition. The wrecking crews were given permission to begin their work, and one of America's greatest architectural achievements was sentenced to death. On October 28, 1963, the demolition of Pennsylvania Station officially began. It would take 3 years to complete. 3 years during which New Yorkers would watch as their city destroyed a masterpiece. The demolition of Pennsylvania Station was not quick or clean. The building had been constructed so well with materials so solid and substantial that tearing it down proved to be an enormous challenge. The contractors had expected the job to take perhaps a year. It ended up taking 3. The pink granite columns that lined the exterior, each weighing multiple tons, had to be cut apart piece by piece. The steel framework that supported the glass ceiling was so massive and so well constructed that cutting torches struggled to get through it. The marble floors, laid with such precision that they had survived 50 years of constant foot traffic without cracking, resisted every attempt to remove them intact. The demolition contractors later admitted that if they had known how difficult the job would be, they would have charged significantly more. But by then, they were committed, and so the slow grinding work of destruction continued day after day, month after month. For many New Yorkers, watching Pennsylvania Station come down was the moment they realized what they were losing. When the building was intact, its grandeur was easy to take for granted, but seeing those massive columns reduced to rubble, watching as the soaring ceiling was dismantled piece by piece, made the scale of the loss suddenly visible and real. Photographers documented the demolition obsessively. Norman McGrath took hundreds of photographs showing the building in various stages of destruction, images that would later become important historical documents. These photographs capture something beyond just architectural documentation. They show a kind of civic tragedy playing out in real time, a city destroying part of its own soul for what now seemed like questionable financial reasons. The eagles that had stood guard over the waiting room were removed and sold to private collectors. Some of the granite columns were broken up and dumped in the New Jersey Meadowlands, where they still sit today, buried under decades of accumulated trash and development. Other architectural elements were salvaged by collectors, but the vast majority of Pennsylvania Station's materials were simply hauled away as debris and disposed of. By 1966, Pennsylvania Station was gone. In its place was a hole in the ground where workers were beginning to construct the new Madison Square Garden. The Pennsylvania Railroad, which had received approximately $24 million from the sale, used that money to pay down some of its debt. Within 2 years, the company would merge with its old rival, the New York Central Railroad, in a desperate attempt to stay solvent. By 1970, the merged company would be bankrupt, and the federal government would have to step in to prevent the complete collapse of rail service in the Northeast. The new Penn Station, which opened in 1968 beneath Madison Square Garden, was everything the original had not been. It was cramped, dark, confusing, and universally hated from the moment it opened. Passengers who had once descended grand staircases into well-lit, spacious platforms now navigated through a maze of low-ceilinged corridors that felt more like a basement than a transportation hub. The architectural critic Paul Goldberger would later write that the new Penn Station looked like it was designed by someone who had never seen the original and had been told only that they needed to fit train platforms underground. There was no natural light, no sense of grandeur, no acknowledgement that this was supposed to be a public space that people would use every single day. Visitors to New York who arrived at the new Penn Station often assumed they had made a wrong turn and ended up in a service entrance. It was that bad. And it remains that bad today, widely considered one of the worst major transit hubs in America, a daily reminder of what was lost. If there is any redemption in the story of Pennsylvania Station's destruction, it is that the outrage and regret that followed led directly to the creation of the modern historic preservation movement in America. The demolition had proven beyond any doubt that beautiful, historically significant buildings could be destroyed simply because their owners found it profitable to do so. It demonstrated that without legal protections, no building, no matter how beloved or important, was safe from the wrecking ball. In 1965, just 2 years after Penn Station's demolition began, New York City passed its Landmarks Preservation Law. This law created the Landmarks Preservation Commission, which had the power to designate buildings as landmarks and prevent their demolition without public review. It was the first comprehensive preservation law of its kind in the United States, and it was passed in direct response to the loss of Pennsylvania Station. Ada Louise Huxtable, who had fought so hard to save Penn Station, wrote that the building was worth more to America in death than it had been in life, because its destruction finally woke people up to the importance of preservation. It was a bitterly ironic legacy, but one that has saved hundreds of other buildings from the same fate. In 1966, 1 year after New York's law, Congress passed the National Historic Preservation Act. This federal law created the National Register of Historic Places and provided a framework for protecting historically significant buildings across the entire country. The timing was not coincidental. The destruction of Penn Station had shocked the nation and created political momentum for preservation that had not existed before. Grand Central Terminal, which had been facing its own demolition plans, was saved partly because of the lessons learned from Penn Station's loss. When developers proposed to build a skyscraper on top of Grand Central in the 1960s, preservationists were ready with legal tools and public support that had not existed just a few years earlier. The Supreme Court upheld Grand Central's landmark status in 1978, establishing an important precedent that property rights are not absolute when historic preservation is at stake. Throughout the country, preservation movements gained strength and sophistication. Cities passed their own landmark laws, federal tax incentives were created to encourage the restoration of historic buildings, and public attitudes toward preservation shifted dramatically. Polls showed that Americans increasingly valued their architectural heritage and supported efforts to protect it. But for Pennsylvania Station itself, these victories came too late. The building was gone, its site occupied by a structure that nearly everyone agrees is vastly inferior. For over 50 years, millions of commuters have passed through the dungeon-like spaces of the modern Penn Station, and many of them have no idea that they are walking through the grave of a masterpiece. There have been numerous proposals over the years to rebuild or reimagine Pennsylvania Station. In 2016, New York announced plans to expand the current Penn Station into the nearby James A. Farley Post Office building, which was also designed by McKim, Mead, and White, and shares some of the architectural language of the original station. This Moynihan Train Hall, which opened in 2021, attempts to recapture some of the grandeur that was lost, though it can never fully replace what was destroyed. The story of Pennsylvania Station raises questions that remain relevant today. How do we balance property rights against public interest? What obligations do we have to preserve the past for future generations? Who gets to decide what is worth saving? These questions do not have easy answers, but the destruction of Penn Station taught us that some decisions, once made, cannot be undone. Vincent Scully, the architectural historian, perhaps said it best in his famous quote about Penn Station. He wrote, "One entered the city like a god, one scuttles in now like a rat." It is a harsh assessment, but one that captures what was lost. Not just a beautiful building, but a sense of civic pride, public grandeur, and the idea that architecture should inspire and elevate rather than merely accommodate. Today, Pennsylvania Station exists only in photographs, in the memories of those who knew it, and in the countless buildings that were saved, because its destruction shocked America into recognizing the value of preservation. It is a ghost that haunts American architecture, a reminder of what can happen when short-term thinking and financial expediency override considerations of beauty, history, and cultural value. Every day, 650,000 people pass through Penn Station, making it the busiest transportation hub in North America. Almost none of them know that they are walking through what was once called one of the most beautiful buildings in the world. Almost none of them can imagine what was here before, what was lost, and why it was lost. The Pennsylvania Railroad got its $24 million. Madison Square Garden got its new arena, and New York City got a lesson in preservation that it learned too late to save the building that taught it. The modern Penn Station stands as a monument to a different kind of thinking, a reminder that not all progress is forward, and that sometimes what we destroy in the name of modernization is more valuable than anything we build to replace it. Fragments of the original Pennsylvania Station still exist. The eagles that once guarded the waiting room stand in various locations around the New York area. Some of the columns were saved and incorporated into other buildings, but these are just pieces, artifacts of something greater that can never be fully recovered. The preservation movement that arose from Penn Station's ashes has saved countless other buildings from the same fate. Grand Central Terminal still stands. Hundreds of other historic structures across America are protected by laws that did not exist before Pennsylvania Station was destroyed. In that sense, the building's legacy is profound and positive, but standing in the modern Penn Station, in its low-ceilinged corridors and cramped platforms, it is hard not to think about what might have been. It is hard not to imagine what New York would be like today if someone had found a way to save Pennsylvania Station, if someone had been able to convince the railroad and the city that some things are worth more than money. The demolition of Pennsylvania Station was not inevitable. It was a choice, made by people who valued short-term profits over long-term cultural preservation. We live with the consequences of that choice every day in the form of one of the ugliest transit hubs in America, built on the site of what was once one of the most beautiful. The The story of Pennsylvania Station is ultimately a story about what we value as a society and what we are willing to sacrifice for convenience and profit. It is a reminder that once something is gone, it is gone forever, and that the decisions we make about our built environment echo through generations. Pennsylvania Station cannot be rebuilt, but its memory serves as a warning and a challenge. We can do better. We must do better, because the next time, there might not be a second chance. Thank you for watching this deep dive into the tragic story of Pennsylvania Station's destruction. If you found this history as compelling and important as we do, please share this video with others who care about architecture, history, and preservation. And if you have not already, please subscribe to our channel and hit the notification bell. Leave a comment below and tell us, have you ever been to the current Penn Station? Erst